Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar From Gas to Care: Why Public Money Should Fund Women, Not Fossil Fuels. As we mark International Women's Day, whose 2026 theme for all women and girls, rights, equality, empowerment. It's call for accelerated progress toward gender equality, and today's discussion invites us to reflect on a fundamental question: how do global economic and financial decisions support or undermine those very goals? While this day celebrates the achievements of women and girls around the world, it is also a moment to examine the structural choices shaping women's lives, opportunities, and livelihoods. Excuse me. Across the world, multilateral development banks and public finance institutions continue to channel billions of dollars into fossil gas expansion. At the same time, many countries are facing severe underinvestment in care systems, public services, and social protection, which are the areas that are essential for advancing gender equality and supporting women's economic participation. So, our today's discussion will therefore explore a critical question: what are the opportunities, costs when public finance flows to fossil fuels instead of care centered and gender responsive investments? This conversation hopefully brings together perspectives from feminist movements, climate finance analysts, and regional advocates to unpack how gas investments intersect with economic justice, care economies, and the prospects for a just energy transition. So, before we begin, let me briefly introduce our speakers. First, we have Tara Povey from the Bretton Woods Project. She is the Joint Project Coordinator for the Gender Equality and Macroeconomics Project at the Bretton Woods Project. And before joining BWP, she worked as an academic and researcher at SOAS University of London and Goldsmiths University of London. Her work has focused on the policies of the IMF and the World Bank, particularly their impacts on gender based social movements and civil society organizations in the global south. She has published widely on social movements, austerity, and new liberalism in the Middle East and North Africa, as well as women's movements in contemporary Iran. We are also joined by Mara Dolan from the Women's Environment and Development Organization, which is a leading global voice of advancing feminist climate justice and gender responsive climate finance. Mara is a feminist organizer and policy coordinator whose work focuses on narrative strategy and synthesis, particularly at the intersection of care economies, energy justice, and just transition debates. Finally, we are pleased to welcome Haneen Shaheen. Shortly, she will be joining us. She is the Ecological Justice and Campaign Advisor at MENAFEM Movement. Her work advances feminist, ecological, economic, and climate justice across the Middle East and North Africa region. Today, she will bring an important regional perspective on feminist organizing, ecological justice, and economic transformation in the MENA region. We are delighted to have such a strong panel with us today. So, thank you all for joining us today. To start our discussion, I would like to ask each of our speakers to briefly reflect on the broader framing of today's event. My framing question for all speakers is: when we talk about shifting public finance from gas to care, what does that shift mean in practical economic and political terms? So you may have 1 to 2 minutes to respond on this framing question. Then we have our detailed session, definitely. So first, I will start with Tara. Tara, over to you.
Thank you so much, Fiza, and thank you very much for inviting me to speak on this panel with such esteemed colleagues who are very much more expert in the field of climate finance. So my area is mainly, as you say, the policies of the Bretton Woods institutions, and particularly I work on the IMF. But in terms of your question, I think we need to see how the connections between the fossil fuel extraction and the policies of the Bretton Woods institutions, which really are kind of, well, on the one hand, they are encouraging and enabling fossil fuel extraction, but also they sit at the center of this kind of global political economy, this financial architecture, in which, you know, care obviously is unvalued, unpaid, underpaid. And so we need to see this as part of one whole political economy, where the kind of the time and the lives and the bodies of women and gender diverse people are actually part of the political economy that keeps this system going. So really, you know, the role, my role, I guess, here is to talk about the role of these institutions, and really they are kind of shaping this international financial architecture, both in policy terms, which they're able to do through loan conditionality, and through, you know, normative terms as well. And of course, this is hugely harmful because it has disastrous human effects on people and also on the environment as well. But these kind of policies are the result of political choices. So they are, you know, that's the thing that I kind of wanted to try and get across in this you know, response. You know, if we look at, for example, the amount of funds, we often hear from the IMF and the World Bank that austerity is necessary because there just isn't the money to pay for the SDGs or to pay for development or gender equality and those kind of things. But actually, we know that there is money there. For example, the $3 trillion dollars a year that is required per year to meet the SDGs. 2.6 trillion last year was spent on the military, on resource wars that has enormously, obviously, destructive effects. And of course, a range of policy measures that are enabled by the BWIs that really benefit global North multinationals. And, you know, chief among them are the kind of, you know, the oil and gas producing companies as well. So as we know also that the amount that global North countries are paying in terms of climate finance or in terms of development spending is hugely overshadowed by the profit that oil multinationals, oil and gas multinationals, and also that the creditors, chief among them is also the IMF, are able to extract from these regions. So yes, in all, I would say that, you know, what is required in terms of the IMF and the World Bank is to oppose both the kind of policies that and the way that they are able to kind of put these forwards through conditionality, and also this kind of normative framings that they have around the place of fossil fuels.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Tara, for this framing. So over to Haneen.
Yes. Thank you so much, Fiza, and welcome everyone. And I wish that I could say for you all happy International Women's Day, but it's like very weird to say such a word in like what we are facing right now. And it's very weird to think about what women future will look like under these kind of regimes. And so to answer your question, the only idea that comes to my mind is how can how can we talk about care and we talk about shifting while everything now is moving towards extract more fossils to kill more and to start more wars. And in a region that is like literally on fire as we are speaking, and women and girls are the first ones who are like targeted as as like they are not even weaponizing them. They are the target of this current war, whether in Sudan, whether in Iran, whether in Lebanon. It's like it's very hard to think what we need to do in this international system in order to stop this kind of things. And it's not just now about fossils. It's about what this kind of investment is doing in us, it's shaping our futures. And when we talk about care, while like people are still bombing and they're actually dragging their stuff and trying to flee from the bombing and the rockets, it's like we are centuries far away. And I have no answer because every single thing now is investing and financing an ongoing war that has no future of ending. It's just like they are escalating and they are putting more money and effort in it. The banks are investing a lot of money and support. Countries are supporting, like current regimes in the whole region are like supporting such a war. And the only target people now are women and girls. And I'm so pessimistic, and I'm so sorry to sound like that, but I'm very pessimistic because do if we change policies in these banks, if we change like protocol, if we created new programs, things are going to change. The war is going to stop. I'm sorry to start my speech with that because I prepared a proper like speech and discussion and like hoping people like were.
No, no, today's we are
But
celebrating Women's Day, so talk from your heart.
exactly, but it's just like I cannot tolerate the fact that everything is just like all the money is going to finance this war and make this war endless.
It's
And we are the
tragic.
targets.
Yeah,
And there is no international law to protect us anymore. And there is no, it's like it's us versus the wall versus the sea and these mega powers who are like designing how to kill us fast and painfully. And I
yeah,
will stop here. I'm sorry.
yeah. Completely understandable, completely understandable. Thank you, Haneen, for your insights. So, in short, we can say that when we talk about shifting public finance, so it really means that there should be the shift of all money to peace, like that. So over to Mara for your framing answer of this question.
Hello, all. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's really wonderful to be here. So thank you, Fizza, for the invitation, and Tara and Haneen. It's wonderful to see you all, and thank you all for joining us. I think when I hear the question, and when I really even saw the sort of framing of this webinar from gas to care, and thinking about all of the really critical shifts that it catalyzes, that must catalyze, um, I was thinking a lot about Haneen's provocation as well, and thinking about knowing that we cannot confront the climate crisis generally, but our current energy system in particular, without really confronting militarization, without confronting white supremacy, without confronting colonialism. And I think we have to really acknowledge that we have to dismantle this fossil fuel based, privatized energy system that is completely built on violence, that is completely built on war and domination, and building something new in its place. And I think feminists are incredibly talented at always pointing out the ways that um, that in communities, in spaces, feminists are building solutions and have always created alternatives that put care at the center, that spearhead visions of feminist energy justice, that honor energy as a human right, that don't require violations of human rights, not something that you have to pay to access, or that is made possible by the exploitation of resources and labor of some for the benefit of others. But actually, from a feminist analysis, has that deep process of consultation, of consent, prioritization of the communities that are most impacted by the current violences of our energy system, being at the front lines of defining what our next energy system looks like. So I think when I think about that shift, I think about how massive and intersectional it has to be. I think about shifting power. I think about shifting resources. I think about shifting minds towards what we can create together and what that feminist economy built on an ethic of care at its center. And I would just say to Haneen's point, I think something um, that I'm prioritizing more than ever in this moment is really thinking about what that shift means for possibilities of repair, what real reparations looks like in design and in action, and in thinking that a transition of our institutions of our economies from gas to care alone is not all that we need. We need some deep backwards facing and front facing repair that looks at the forms of violences that have taken place to create what we live in today and thinks about what are the demands of the people who've been most impacted in terms of resources, in terms of care, that actually would represent some form of repair.
Thank you very much. Brilliant, Mara. Thank you. So, when we talk about shifting public finance from gas to care, so it means shift from the angle of human rights overall. So let's deep dive into our main detailed session. So I'm coming towards you, Tara, again. So my question is that multilateral development banks often justify gas investments in the name of development and economic growth. From your analysis, how do these financing decisions affect women and gender equality, particularly when public resources that could support care systems and social services are instead directed towards for fossil fuel infrastructure? So over to you, Tara.
Yes, absolutely. Thanks so much for the question. I mean, yeah, just to start with the justification of these policies. So, yeah, they justify it on the basis of, I mean, they used to justify it just on the basis of economic growth and development. I mean, we can obviously firstly ask the question, economic growth for who? It's not the type of economic growth which is growth at all costs, which involves the not just the destruction of the society's ability to provide for its own citizens, but also the natural environment. That's obviously for in a system where the shares of that growth, so even if you look at the labor share of GDP, for example, are lower and lower and lower, so it's not growth for the majority of people and it's extremely destructive. So those claims in itself are obviously quite questionable. But also just recently, they have also been, the IMF and the World Bank have been justifying this kind of twofold policy that I've been looking at for a while, which is on the one hand, they are really mandating that countries increase fossil fuel production. And on the other hand, they are cutting subsidies and enacting austerity measures that directly, obviously, have harmful effects on the population as well. So this is a kind of twofold attack, really, on the many of the countries of the global South, and what enables them to behave like this. And particularly, I look at the IMF, which is, even if you could say that there is like a worse bad institution, which you can't really say, but the IMF is like pretty much the top in terms of like the offenders here, right? So so if you look at the IMF, what's really behind this is the system of austerity, debt, and extraction. That's the power structure, the political economy that enables them to kind of construct an international financial architecture in which, as I described previously, the profits flow into the hands of oil and gas multinationals and into the hands of creditors, and those obviously are, majority of them are based in the global north. So as we know, countries are now facing the worst debt crisis in a generation. The UN research that was published last year, much research obviously has been published on this, but 1 in 3 developing countries, home to over 3.4 billion people, spend more on debt interest payments than on education or health. And historic debt levels are not an accident. They are a product of the policies of the IMF and the World Bank, particularly structural adjustment that has destroyed domestic demand and that has really in some ways, a kind of reenactment or reproduction of a colonial economic model in which global South countries are there for resources to be extracted from them, in the case of raw materials, and then, the kind of end products are. Production is separated out from supply, so the end products the supply is controlled through the multinationals as well. So, but we can also see that historic debt levels they've become inextricable from increasing fossil fuel dependence. And so this is the excuse that the IMF uses. So it goes to a country and it says, well, you have these debt levels, you have to pay your creditors, so you have to do fossil fuel extraction because that's the way to make money to pay your creditors. So we can see, for example, in the Vaca Muerta project in Argentina, which is an enormously environmentally destructive gas fracking project. You can see in Ecuador, IMF loans were premised on the government's ability to double fossil fuel production in 1 year. In 2025, in Suriname, private creditors gained rights to 30% of Suriname's oil production until 2025 in a deal that was enabled by the IMF. So sorry, I'm going a little bit bigger than gas, but I mean that in itself is a kind of colonial agreement. I mean, these are the kind of agreements that you would see, like capitulations that happened in the 19th century around, selling off entire, productive forces of your economy. And so obviously this kind of debt and the erosion of state capacity and the growing dependence on foreign private capital, which is what kind of is driving this, is actually what's constraining global South countries' ability also to pursue green industrial policies because of the punitive costs of capital, which is much higher, as you know, in global South countries than it is, in terms of interest rates and things like that, than it is in wealthier countries. And so the other side of this coin is the austerity measures, which, as I've said, are really inextricably connected to debt, because austerity is what actually stops the kind of industrial policy and the investment in, the areas of the economy. So, these are conditionalities which the IMF enforces through, again, its loan agreements, because countries become dependent on these loans for critical financing. Obviously, these kind of financing, given the international financial architecture and how much is being extracted, it shouldn't be loans at all. The fact that global North countries and the gas and oil companies are making such huge amounts of profits, and the creditors are, still at the center, demanding more and more from people, obviously that is a kind of hugely unjust system in itself. But, these conditionalities, which are basically austerity measures, subsidy reform, cutting public subsidies, public sector wage freezes, privatization, labor market flexibilization, regressive taxation, all of these austerity measures, which are also destroying domestic demand, they are really, obviously not gender neutral. None of this is kind of a gender, not that there is anything that exists that is gender neutral, but particularly these are not gender neutral. So these kind of reforms, these policies, which the IMF is has the power to mandate, in this context of this debt crisis, are really deepening the exploitation of women and gender diverse people and the extraction of their labor, skills, time, resources in the name of producing economic growth and stability. But it actually doesn't, really have to do with that at all. It has to do with paying the creditors. and producing profit for the multinationals, basically. And then, as I mentioned before, to me, this is really the continuation of a colonial model of development. And it's kind of this, obviously, a neoliberal model which rolls back state welfare systems while entrenching the power of private and external sector actors in the economy. And that this kind of model has its roots in the colonial era, and it has been maintained to this day, basically, through dollar supremacy, through militarism, and also fossil fuel dependency as well. And actually, Mara is very, very right to also point to the ways that this model is being resisted historically by large-scale movements, and also it's being resisted by the actions of people every day as well. So it is definitely something that can be resisted. It's not again, this is a kind of political choices that are being made. But really, it's based on the deindustrialization of global South countries' economies. The kind of policies of structural adjustment, forcing countries into the position of producing raw materials for the global market with little control over commodity prices and trade. And then, as a result, the debt crisis, and then the issuing critical finance as a with these conditionalities, including the privatizations of billions of dollars of state assets. And so, this kind of set of policies that I'm describing, they don't have a development agenda, obviously. That's not their primary purpose. Their purpose is not to do something that's good for gender equality or climate or things like that. But they do have other objectives. And if we look at, for example, more recently, the privatization of energy as well in the global South, and the de-risking of fossil fuel projects in the global South for gas multinationals based in the global North is a huge economic boon for them. It's creating masses and masses amounts of profit. There is literally no way that Credit Suisse or HSBC or Total Energies are able to go and undertake a project, fossil fuel expansion project in Argentina or in Mozambique or in Angola or Ecuador, unless there is a system there where there is creditors, and there is a kind of system of de-risking, i.e. kind of making it safe for private capital, that the IMF and the World Bank are at the center of this system. So they are there to basically enable the de-risking of the global South for this kind of fossil fuel expansion. And as an even further step, we have seen that the president of the World Bank, Ajay Banga, you probably saw, has joined Trump's Board of Peace. So not content with this kind of de-risking happening through the actual mandate of the institutions, they actually have, very clearly allied themselves by joining the Board of Peace within this project, which is the de-risking of the conflict zones, as they are called, of Gaza, to have this kind of real estate development project, which is obviously a continuation of the genocide against the Palestinian people.
Yeah.
So, they have really gone way out there to kind of take these steps. So basically, this kind of fossil fuel extraction, this system is creating profits for oil and gas multinational. It's creating profits for the creditors more generally. And sometimes the IMF will argue, well, if you do this kind of extraction, then, you can then spend that money on development goals. But we know that doesn't happen, because all of that is being sucked up by debt servicing, and all of that debt servicing is going to the global North and going to the IMF. Sorry, that was a bit of a rant. Yeah, I hope it it's helpful in some ways. But, you know, in terms of what we can do about it, obviously we should oppose the policies themselves. We should point to the people who profit. I mean, HSBC, I'm based in London. HSBC headquarters is just not very far away from my house. You know,
Yeah.
they are the ones who are profiting from Vaca Muerta in Argentina. You know, Credit Suisse is in Paris, I guess, or Switzerland, and you know, Total Energy's headquarters are in Paris. So we should start talking about this system and what it looks like. Yeah.
Thank you, Tara. Thank you for your insights and analysis and framing this whole thing that how these MDB's policies are really enhancing the gender inequality embedded in their policies, in their this colonial model of this financial architecture. So thank you very much. So now we are going towards Mara. So, Mara, my question to you is from a feminist climate justice perspective, how does the current model of fossil fuel financing reinforce gender inequalities and undermine investments in care systems and gender responsive public services? So, over to you, Mara.
Thanks, Fiza. And thank you, Tara. I learned so much. I'm not a person who knows a lot about our economic institutions that it's so clear are causing such harm, but I feel like I need folks and allies like you to help me understand and break down some of these behind the scenes sort of realities of how these economic institutions function. And it's just such valuable insight. So thank you so much. Um, okay, so we do really comes into our work, like I said, knowing that we understand the root causes of um, the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis to be capitalism, extraction, imperialism, white supremacy, and patriarchy. And that when we're thinking about feminist solutions and feminist analyses, we're talking about full systems change, right? We're challenging the logic of fossil fuel exploitation and domination and greed. And building systems instead that are centered on care and regeneration and racial, gender, and economic justice. But I think importantly, while some may stop at sort of drawing a difference between, on one hand, fossil fuel-based energy, and on the other hand, quote unquote, renewable or green energy systems, it's important to remember that a transition to renewable energy is not inevitably just and fair, and that the potential and the current reality of exploitation of land, bodies, labor, and violations of consent to also advance renewable energy must be resisted. There cannot be an energy transition for the benefit of some in the global north at the detriment of others in the global majority. So I think feminist analysis teaches us to think really critically about power and systems change and how we're financing this kind of shift. It's not just about asking where are the women in leadership positions, or are there women working at these banks, or adding women to policies and stirring. It's really about fundamentally, I think, examining how systems of oppression shape people's lived realities and how we have to challenge them to build something new. So I'll briefly move through three ways that a transition off of fossil fuels and gas and towards a world that must be feminist in order to be just might have some thought provocations for us. So first, I would say feminist activists, ecofeminists, women's human rights defenders, land defenders have really painstakingly illustrated the connection between bodily autonomy and extractivism, and the need for an ethic of consent to really permeate throughout our policies. Um, and I think frontline defenders and Indigenous women and Two-Spirit peoples have really long sounded the alarm around the crisis of gender-based violence that is connected to fossil fuel production, including gas production, known to many as colloquially as man camps. When fossil fuels when fossil fuel companies come to town, it is really well documented that there are increases in gender-based and sexual violence against women and gender diverse people, and that the corporate power of fossil fuel companies, paired with institutionalized patriarchy and racism, protects these men and fossil fuel companies from any form of accountability and justice, right? This is intimately connected to the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, and we have to lift it up every day. So many of the minerals that are mined for use in renewable energy, like for example, lithium, can produce some of these same dynamics of harm and violations of consent as fossil fuels. And activists are really sounding the alarm about man camps and other forms of exploitation and extraction. So a phase out of fossil fuels alone doesn't mean that this violence ends. We have to be really purposeful in making sure that it isn't recreated in the mining for these so-called critical minerals that are critical for whom. So an ethic of consent in a fossil fuel phase out requires us to really honor free, prior, and informed consent, honor bodily autonomy and the safety of women and girls, and the right to live free from violence in all its forms. Second, I'll just flag as well that I think a really important consideration when thinking about resourcing the shift is that fossil fuel health impacts on our bodies are gendered, they are racialized, and a phase out must recognize and repair that harm. Living near fossil fuel production sites, including gas, and the exposure to the associated chemicals have been correlated with horrific impacts on reproductive health. It's been shown to increase cancers, poor pregnancy outcomes, and we know that the climate impacts caused by fossil fuels like extreme heat and pollution also have distinct gendered and reproductive health impacts, right? So we can't take a one-size-fits-all approach to healing and preventing further health impacts during a fossil fuel phase out, but we have to understand where these impacts are happening and phasing them out in a way that demands repair. So ensuring that the people who have paid, that have caused the damage, pay for the repair, right? Everyone's getting free healthcare for the ways that fossil fuel companies have harmed their bodies in that way. And when communities have been poisoned and neighborhoods have been harmed for generations, what kinds of repair that looks like is determined by them. Thirdly, and I think really critically, a feminist phase out of fossil fuels requires us to really think about what kind of economy we're building next, which I think is what we're really gesturing to in this whole panel. How that economy can erode gendered and racialized inequalities and build something new in its place that puts care at the center. So, what do I mean by that? It's essential, I think, to understand that this fossil fuel-based economy is built on the backs of women, especially women of color and women of the global majority, through invisible and rarely discussed realities of care work. And care work really is that labor that we all rely on, but is rarely valued, rarely compensated, and it's not understood through traditional male-dominated labor frameworks and sort of theories. But care work is the work that makes all other work possible. And some care workers exist in unionized formal sectors like healthcare, education, and childcare, but most do not. Their care work is performed in what's called the second or third shift. It's performed without labor protections. It's performed without the right to unionize. And it's the work of childcare, elder care, domestic work, land stewardship, community healthcare. And capitalism doesn't see or recognize these workers, but without a doubt, if their labor stopped tomorrow, the economy would collapse. It's an unimaginably big unpaid subsidy to the global economy, and it is overwhelmingly women of the global majority who perform it and pay it. So, since care work is this invisible unpaid infrastructure of our current fossil fuel economy, if we're not intentional in changing it, care work will simply transition to being the invisible unpaid infrastructure of a so-called green economy, right? It would still be built on the backs of women. So we know that if we're not thinking about universal childcare, elder care, social protections, things like things that focus on community well-being and the well-being of all people, if we're not putting that at the center of what we think about as a just transition, phasing off of fossil fuels alone will actually not do much to work to support all of the unpaid care work that is the invisible subsidy of that economy. Um, Many of the jobs that we need to invest in are already low carbon, life supporting, life giving, life saving, community centered work. It's the invaluable work that we all rely on, and it should be compensated as such. We know the climate crisis will increase this demand for care, so it's critical that we respond um, valuing it in the way that it is demanded. So I'll just close
Yeah.
by reiterating those three things that I hope folks can take away. The feminist pillar of a fossil fuel phase out helps us illuminate that we need an ethic of consent, repair and recognition for the gendered health impacts of fossil fuels, and serious integration of care work as a valued part of the economy. Thanks, Biza. Back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mara, for all these recommendations and three important ways of suggesting that how this feminist phase out of fossil fuel can be the main gender at the center. So very quickly, as we are also running short of time, I will be coming towards my third speaker, Haneen from MENA Fame. Haneen, from the perspective of feminist movements in the MENA region, how do fossil fuel investments intersect with economic justice, social inequality, and women's rights? So over to you, Haneen.
Yeah, thank you, Feza. So basically, it's the fossil fuel industry is at the heart and core of all the things you said. It's like these investments are not only about energy or economic growth. It's about power, inequality, and whose lives are considered expandable. And in a region like the MENA region or the Swana region, which is like has the world's largest oil and gas reserve, and our economies mainly remain dependent on fossil fuels still. This dependence not only delivered justice or prosperity for our communities, injustice, it delivered like this authoritarian governance that deep the inequality in our communities and made this kind of industry the heart and core of every action the countries are taking. The feminist movement in the region sees fossil expansion as part of a border extractive model that concentrate wealth and power in the hands of the elites and the multinational corporation, while marginalizing communities are suffering under these kind of actions. And I'm building on what Tara and Mara said. It's just research has like long shown that oil-dependent economies tend to reduce women participation in labor and reinforce patriarchal structure and limiting women political and economic power. It's at the same time, fossil fuel economies divert public investment away from social infrastructure. No healthcare, no education, no care system, and these kind of services. Everything now is like invested to boom this kind of infrastructure, and people are literally left behind. And when all these kind of systems that we are hoping and asking for collapsed, the burden is totally shift into like the backs of the women, which already women in this region perform the majority of unpaid care and the majority of work. We are living under huge austerity conditions, climate crisis, wars, and parallelly, the extracting and the oil and gas investment and work is still ongoing. And if you like, it's very obvious as well if when you look at what the news is showing in this current war in Iran, the first thing that they are bombing is like the oil and gas reservoirs because they know the economies are so dependent on these kind of things, and this is what's going to chicken government. And also these kind of escalations pushing our countries toward militarization and instability. And the war economies are so frustrating to women and girls. And it's the main core of the injustice economy. And this is all for the oil and gas. So the feminist movements in the region, they were asking when we talk about the energy transition or climate solutions or ending fossil fuels, we are just like trying to think how we are going to do that while every single time we are pushed towards war economies. And every escalation, every attack, every sanction divert resources away from social protection, from climate action toward militarization. It increases the economic validity, the pressure, insecurity across the region. And again, the social cost is carried also by women and marginalized communities. So it's this is why it's very important currently to just look when we ask for phasing out of fossil fuels, when we ask for um, justice, equality, all these things need to be asked all together. We cannot ask for one thing and leave another thing behind. Climate justice, peace, economic justice cannot be separated. A just transition for a reason, for a region that cannot replace fossil fuels, has the depend like 80% of its economic dependency on these reservoirs, and under constant war, it needs to have a very different plan towards this kind of transition. And the world, the global north need to like push for this agenda, not the other way around. It's very hard that the global south left behind trying to scream out of our lungs saying this is what we want to see. And the global north governments just, well, the only thing that they are doing is like militarizing and bombing the global south because of the oil and gas, and the banks they created support that. So finally, for me, the means of investment in investing in public goods, care economies, community-owned renewable energy is redistributing wealth away from fossil fuel profit and ensuring that women, frontline communities shape the decision. But this cannot happen while people are voting for governments that constantly, continuously eager and wanting to bomb other countries for their resources. The exploitation of labor, of minerals, and looking at critical minerals as it's the global north owned treasures by God's superpowers will not take us anywhere near to not economic justice, justice in general. It's like it's very hard to talk about a specific term of justice while the main concept of justice is so lost in translation because now every single community has its own different type of justice now. So it's crazy. And I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Haneen, for all these insights. Now, as we are also running short of time, but definitely we have still 7, 8 minutes. So let's open the floor. People are invited. Just raise your hand and open your mic. You can speak up. But first of all, there is the question by Lorraine, and Tara has also responded it wonderfully. But I would really like to invite Lorraine if she would like to give her intervention very briefly, just for the discussion and the things. Lorraine. Sorry, you are on mute, Lorraine. So anyone else, please raise your hand and you can come in. If you have any comment, you want to say your insights, anything on this International Women's Day, please feel free. Okay. Lauren is saying that there is a lot of noise in her background, so she cannot come in. So, if there are no questions and if nobody wants to really come in, so for the closing reflections, very quickly from each speaker, one brief closing thought. If there is one policy or investment shift that should happen in the next 5 years to move from gas to care-centered economies, what would it be in 2 to 3 sentences? So let's start from Tara.
Um, yes, it's a big question, but yes, as I put in the chat, when it comes to the role of the Bretton Woods institutions and the IMF, it's really debt that enables this. It's debt and austerity, the two sides of the same coin. They are basically the same policy, different sides. So I think, debt cancellation, particularly, and if we look at the countries are paying creditors for the fossil fuel extraction. So, that public money is also being spent not just on de-risking, but also on paying creditors for when the promised, billions from, foreign direct investment in fossil fuel projects doesn't materialize, which, as we know, is not going to, that hasn't happened since the 1990s, and the IMF is still talking about it. So this policy has never worked. But, then the public end up paying again. So, if you look at the public in global south countries, they are paying several times. They're paying through austerity. They are paying through the direct impacts of the climate crisis. They are paying debt interest payments to foreign creditors, and they are paying to de-risk their own resources for multinationals. And debt is the kind of driving, it's the enabler of this. So yes, debt cancellation and particularly for those unjust debts, particularly that are associated with the fossil fuel projects themselves as well.
Thank you, Tara. So debt cancellation is the key thing. This is what the analysis of Tara. So now over to Mara, your closing reflections.
I would say to keep it short and sweet, my general sort of framework for assessing any action item is divest from harm, invest in care. I think we all know, and it's been pointed to several times already by folks, we have the resources we need to take care of people's needs and to actually provide social protections that care for communities and people. And it is a choice of resourcing to be resourcing death, genocide, war, and militarization. And so divesting from those things, divesting from extraction, from harm, and reopening up the space for investing in things that provide care, for me is the key.
Thank you, Mara. So the social protection is the key by Mara. Over to Haneen.
For me, it's like ending wars. It's like a country to like start a war, it needs to like think zillions of times. So it's not just they woke up in the morning and decide like let's bomb our neighbor. This does not apply. So we need to have a very harsh policy on investing in militarization, investing in like wars, taking our kids to fight other kids just because our leaders are crazy, and and invest in, like Mara said, in like things that protect us, not kill us, and definitely cancel debts because that's our like the thing that starts everything. So yeah. That's for me.
Thank you, Haneen. Thank you. So stopping war from Haneen. So with this, our time is also up. Thank you.
This is, I say, sorry, interrupt.
Sorry, Aslam,
There is
we
a
can't.
networking available. Is the I think touches of the concept of justice. That's one thing.
Sorry, we can't hear you clearly. There is
Okay.
internet issue.
Yeah. Okay, I will try to put.
Please type your question or intervention in the chat.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks all. Thank you to our speakers.
Thank you for
Thank you.
organizing, Fiza. It's been wonderful. Thank you, Haneen. Thank you, Tara.
Yeah, Mara, Tara, Haneen for sharing their insights, and to everyone who joined us today. So thank you very much and take good care. Bye-bye.